Hi everybody, today I'm going to be talking about the books I read in the month of May, followed by some life and channel updates. The first book being Empire of Silence by Christopher Bacchio. This is book one in the Sun Eater series. This is an epic sci-fi space opera, sci-fantasy I should say. And if you've been around the book community, especially in the sci-fi fantasy space, you've probably heard of this series because it is very popular. I'm going to give you the setup of book one, but feel free to skip with the timestamp if A, you like to go into your books blind, or B, you've already read this book and don't need the setup. This takes place in the distant future. Humans have colonized other planets and created what is called the Solan Empire, which is comprised of various houses. There's an elite class of citizens called the Palatines, which have genetically enhanced themselves over generations in order to have specific physical attributes and to be able to live long lives. There are also lower class citizens in this world that are exploited for labor, such as mining uranium. And there are also slaves that are thrown into a coliseum and beaten and killed for sport and spectacle. Aliens also exist in this universe, and they are known as the main enemy of mankind. And in fact, at the beginning of the story, we learn of an invasion of a potential war that's looming with these aliens in the Solan Empire. And I'll also quickly mention that there are humans that are described in the story as having some mixture of technology and human biology, and that is seen by some as an abomination. This story is told in first-person narration from a character named Hadrian. Hadrian is telling the story from the future. He's chronicling it, he's writing it down, and he explains in the first couple of pages that he has committed genocide, he has destroyed a son. He also explains that the Solan Empire has its own archived version of this story in which Hadrian has been executed, he has been hanged for his crime. So we are learning through Hadrian's perspective the events that led him to make this decision. And because this is his version of the story, of course, we're going to question his reliability as a narrator. So Hadrian starts out with his teenage years. He explains that he's Palatine, he's the elite class, and as a result, he has violet eyes and black hair. He has a very tense relationship with his father and his brother. He has a distant relationship with his mother, who is a librettist, and I love that detail. As someone who loves opera, I thought it was cool that there is opera in space opera. He also has a very close relationship with his mentor, who he describes as making him the man that he is. And his mentor says many sage-like phrases that echo in Hadrian's thoughts throughout the story. Personality-wise, we learn that Hadrian is melodramatic. And while that is consistent throughout the story, I don't know that I needed to be reminded from Hadrian at least 4 to 5 times throughout the book that he's melodramatic, but he considers himself melodramatic. And again, I think that that is consistent with his narrative voice throughout the story. And another thing about Hadrian that's interesting is that he is someone who tends to look across the aisle. He seems to be someone who wants to connect with others despite societal boundaries. He's also someone who loves art, and he would rather be sketching in his sketchbook rather than going to the Colosseum and watching slaves being beaten. And he also has some scholarly interests and a disdain for the religion that is prominent in the Solan Empire. Another thing to say about Hadrian is that he has very clear internal conflicts. He finds himself trapped in situations, and in trying to escape certain fates, he finds himself resorting to behavior that he would otherwise not engage in. So there's a little bit of irony threaded throughout the story when it comes to that. Before getting into the themes of the story, I want to explain why I picked this book up. I picked this book up because it's been on my TBR for the longest time. I've had it on my series TBR for the last few years, and I keep putting it off. But right now, I happen to be in a read-along of Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe with Christopher Bacchio. This was organized by John from Talking Story, and it involves several other booktubers. And so while I am reading Book of the New Sun, I figured, why not go ahead and pick up Sun Eater, since I am engaging in conversations with this author, and I know that Christopher Bacchio has been highly influenced by Book of the New Sun. And then lastly, I was invited to a read-along with my friends Thomas R. Howell and David from Four Corners of the Page. They've already read and discussed book one, but they invited me right after that to go ahead and join them, so they're waiting for me to catch up into Howling Dark so we can have a discussion for the second book. I specifically wanted to talk about this read-along before going into the themes of Empire of Silence, because in that discussion that David and Thomas had, David had this brilliant insight about the theme of language and violence throughout the story. Now, when you read the book, without going into detail or spoilers, you will see how important and prominent language is in Empire of Silence. I think that the way David framed this in terms of violence in language was quite compelling. He explained it in the spoiler-free section, but he went into detail in the spoiler-filled section. So I highly recommend that if you've read this book and you're curious, that you check out that discussion. They both had wonderful points to bring up, both Thomas and David. And I do agree with David. I think that language and violence was an interesting intersection to consider in this story. Additionally, I would say that this has a little bit of the theme of language as it relates to the growth of culture or civilization. There are also some interesting ways of looking at masculinity, either toxic masculinity or balanced masculinity. It's not overtly stated in this story, but I think that there's a way of looking at this story through that lens. And there was a tiny bit about how gendered language plays a role in othering. I wanted that to be explored a little bit more deeply, but I noticed it was there in part. I think that there's also a way of looking at the exploitation of a lower class citizen in terms of gender, and then later that being flipped to an elite class citizen and the opposite gender. Lastly, I would say there's a question that's brought up about the value of a human, especially when it comes to the elite class citizens that have been genetically enhanced versus lower class citizens or other kinds of humans that have been modified in some way. What does that mean about the value of humanity? Who is more valuable or who is more human? There's an interesting question when it comes to that, especially as humans see themselves as superior to aliens. Now for the downside. As much as I appreciated some of the setup and ideas introduced in this story, I struggled to connect with the writing style. I found the writing style inconsistent. At times I did find some lovely passages. At other times I had difficulty connecting to the prose. I found some of the passages felt a little bit forced. I had difficulty as a result feeling immersed in the world. The visual aspect was the hardest for me with this story, and it's not something that I've encountered as much with other space operas I've read. And it helped a lot when I talked to my friend Jake from Nerd Level Rising on his live show, that he told me that Rocchio felt like he struggled as a writer with this first installment because he himself does not visualize what he writes. And that came through to me as somebody who visualizes what she reads. This also happens to be a topic I've talked about here on my channel. If you want to check out the video, Do You Visualize What You Read? I also found that some of the side characters just faded into the background for me. There were names that would recur, and I would have difficulty pinning who those characters were. This is something I struggled with personally, and I understand he was quite young and still finding his voice as an author, so I have hopes that I will connect a bit more to his writing style as I move on in the series, but it is a concern I have based on how I felt about this first book and how popular it is. I also want to say when it comes to the writing that I noticed some passages that were extremely similar to Book of the New Sun, Shadow of the Torturer. I wouldn't have noticed the similarity except that I had just finished Shadow of the Torturer a couple of weeks before starting Sun Eater, and the passages in Shadow of the Torturer were significant to me. These were passages that I found very important throughout the story. They stood out to me in the story. They were passages I naturally highlighted. So when I found passages that were extremely similar in the Empire of Silence book, I found they stood out to me. So I'll go ahead and share them. We believe we invent symbols. The truth is, they invent us. We are their creatures, shaped by their hard defining edges. We think ourselves the master of such symbols, but they are our masters. It is a profound mistake to believe that we must know of such things to be influenced by them, and in fact, to believe so is to believe in the most debased and superstitious kind of magic. It is a mistake to believe we must know a thing to be influenced by it. It is a mistake to believe the thing must even be real. So those are my Empire of Silence thoughts. Please let me know. Is it me or is it the book? Or are we just a bad match? Do you think I'll feel differently when I read Howling Dark? That is my hope, and I am committed to reading that book. I guess I'll decide after finishing that book how I'll feel when I continue. I know Thomas also had some struggles feeling immersed in this first book. So I'm looking forward to talking with Thomas and David when I get to Howling Dark, and I'll keep you all updated about that read-along. Wall of Storms is book 2 in the Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. This is an Asian epic fantasy series that Ken Liu himself has called silkpunk. I'm going to talk about this term here in a minute, and I'll go ahead and say that I was excited to get to this book because I'd heard from fans of this series, this 4-book fantasy series, that this is the best book in the series. And I also greatly enjoyed the first book, Grace of Kings. I'll link my spoiler-free thoughts in the cards, and I'll link the spoiler-filled discussion that I hosted here on my channel with Philip Chase and Chris Navo. This book takes place 6 years after the events that end in book 1, and it also has some crossover characters, but it introduces some new characters. I greatly enjoyed the new cast of characters introduced, especially a female character named Thera. Magically speaking, we're introduced to what is called silkmotic technology, which speaks to that silk punk genre description. And this particular technology is based on engineering. It is related to the themes of the story, which I'll get to, and it's described in far more detail than is my preference, but it is important in the story, especially as it relates to battle tactics against certain magical creatures. I'll keep it vague here, and it has to do with the airships that are in this world. Additionally, I'll say that there are gods in this story, and as in book 1, the gods sometimes have like a distant passive role, and sometimes they interfere very directly into the story. And in this installment, we get some revelatory insights when it comes to the gods. Now, when it comes to the themes of the story, I would say a huge theme in this story has to do with innovation, ingenuity, especially as it relates to engineering. And thematically, this also relates to the role of equity versus equality. Unfortunately, the term equity is sometimes weaponized in our current political climate, but I feel as though this story showcases the importance of equity in terms of understanding that talent can come from different places despite social class, and that sometimes people just can't have access and opportunities to showcase that talent, but that looking for talent in different places can bring fresh insights and greater innovation into our area of science, or into our technology or magic or silkmotic technology, I should say. So there are conversations about that, and maybe a bit more on the nose than some people would prefer, but I did appreciate how that played a role in the story, and I think it is prevalent throughout the story, especially as privilege is explored heavily throughout the story as well. The story also explores the role of ethics through different philosophical branches that are described, and this plays a role in character motivation, especially with one particular character who takes a dramatic turn from where they started out in book 1 versus where they end up in book 2. Now I'm going to talk about the writing style in this book, and I want to bring up 3 different points about the writing style. The first has to do with flashback sequences, because there are several flashbacks throughout this book. I am not always against flashback sequences. I can think of many books, many instances where I've enjoyed this technique or device. But in this book, I have to admit that the flashbacks were not something I enjoyed. I found myself wanting to stay more in the present timeline than in the flashback. In all cases, throughout the book, I did understand the purpose that they served, and I saw how they were to lead to greater emotional impact in what was happening in the present. But unfortunately, it was something that I struggled with in this story. The second thing I want to bring up is that Ken Liu relies heavily on telling rather than showing. I am not saying by any means that an author should only rely on one approach. I understand that both have places in good writing, and I'm not even saying that he is poor in his approach to telling rather than showing. I actually think he's quite talented at it. But this does in part relate to the flashbacks, because Ken Liu does give you a historical overview of a society, or he gives you in-depth descriptions of how the magic works. And so this is not approached so much through character perspective as much as it feels like the narrator presenting these things to you. And unfortunately, that additionally made me feel a little bit distanced, and sometimes that was combined with the flashbacks. But all that said, I feel like it serves a purpose again. I know I'm kind of defending it and then also explaining that why it didn't work for me emotionally. I feel like it serves a purpose in Ken Liu's approach because it allows him to be very efficient in his storytelling. I think it's the way he's able to describe so many aspects of a dynasty, so many aspects of an empire, is because he can give you these larger overviews of what's happening. That's not to say he doesn't have good intimate character moments. There were certainly some lovely intimate character moments I could think of in this story, but there were several sections where we were getting larger overviews of what was going on. And that, it made me feel distanced, just as I described with the flashback sequences. And again, these two things were sometimes combined. The last point I want to bring up is a bit more critical. So to balance this out, I first want to say that I've long admired Ken Liu's writing style in that I enjoyed his writing in Grace of Kings. I loved his short story collection, The Paper Menagerie, in which I feel like he shows a range of different techniques. And throughout my experience of his writing, I've noted his ability to write clear, accessible prose, also have a certain elegance of tone at the right moments, and also be able to unfold a picture in a very simple and clear way. And I've enjoyed that. I've enjoyed the way that he writes. That said, there was one thing that grated on my nerves in this book, and that was his use of repetition. And repetition, like flashbacks, there are instances I can think of in other books where I've appreciated the role of repetition and I felt like it enhanced the story and it created momentum. In this case, it did the complete opposite for me. There were certain phrases in this story that were repeated, even introduced in book 1, but repeated so much in book 2 that they became almost like platitudes after a while. I don't know if that's the right word. I don't know if that's the most accurate way of describing it, but there's a phrase, for example, called the most interesting thing. Let's do the most interesting thing. That was brought up so many times in this book that after a while, the most interesting thing, repeated through so many different perspectives, for me became the most banal thing. And there was another statement about fate being coincidences in retrospect. That one was okay, I suppose. I just felt like it overstayed its welcome a little bit. And there was another phrase that I also didn't care for being repeated over and over again, which is, the universe is knowable, the universe is knowable, the universe is knowable. And with that particular phrase, I felt like it spoke to this idea that basically all magic can be explained at a certain point. And I don't know if I want to get behind that in a fantasy world, but I felt like these repetitions, rather than boosting emotional impact, unfortunately, I felt like they diminished it for me. I felt like it grated on my nerves after a while. And this is obviously a very subjective take. I struggled with it though, so please let me know. Was it me or was it the book? Did you feel this way? Did you enjoy those repetitions? I understand if I'm the only one who felt that way, but it was how I felt. It did hurt things for me rather than excite me. So unfortunately, with several of these things I mentioned that grated on me, I found that my enjoyment of book 1 was higher than book 2. And I feel like that is such an unpopular opinion. So was it me or was it the book? Let me know if you felt differently about the repetitions and the flashbacks. I'm sure most people did, because this book has been receiving 5 stars from basically everyone I'm a friend with on BookTube. And I feel like the odd one out a little bit. I know Philip also had some hot takes about it too, and we're going to be discussing it soon with Chris Navo on his channel and read by Kyle, who's a huge fan of this series. Maybe that discussion will help me process my thoughts a little differently, but that's where I land right now. Let me know what you think, and if you think I should continue the series, if you think I will feel differently if I continue. I know that's probably hard to assess based on what I shared, but I'm really struggling with not feeling as excited about this one. Last book to talk about is a nostalgic reread for me, and it's a book that I read when I was like 9 or 10 years old, and it's called Don't Look Behind You by Lois Duncan. I reread this via audio, and the reason I reread this is because I needed a palate cleanser after feeling a bit lukewarm about what I was reading in the month of May. But also, I've thought about this book so many times throughout the years, and I had a dream about it. So that was enough incentive for me to look up the audiobook, which I had access to thanks to an Everend subscription that I still have that is going to be canceled in October. But the reason this book appealed to me so much as a kid, and the reason it stuck with me so many years, is the conflict that the character finds herself in. So this is about a teenage girl named April. April is popular, she's beautiful, she has long blonde hair, she's a star tennis player, she has this ideal boyfriend who treats her really well. And then one day she's in class taking the quiz when she's called to the counselor's office. Once in the counselor's office, she and her family realize that they have to leave their house. They can't tell anybody, they can't say goodbye to anybody or leave any information. So what we discover is that April's father works for the FBI and that a criminal that he was investigating has targeted his family, identified and targeted the family. So in order not to be targeted, they have to undergo the protection of the Federal Witness Security Program, which means they have to be uprooted from their idyllic lives in Norfolk, Virginia, and taken to some swampy town in Florida where they won't be discovered. They have to change their identities, their names. April has to change her name to Valerie, cut off her gorgeous blonde hair. She can't play tennis anymore. She can't contact her boyfriend or her friends. She has to live in this crusty, old, disgusting, moldy house with cobwebs. And she has to go to a school with these cliquey, not so nice teenagers. And it was the whole situation of having to be uprooted from your idyllic life and have to take on this new identity and live in a totally different house, but to do it also with your family. So all her family members are going through this with her, but they all have struggles leaving a different part of their identity behind. So not only are the family members all struggling, but the parents themselves are having fights about this. And I really love the way that Lois Duncan wrote that tension into the story and the way she described the house that they move into. The descriptions were excellent. But those are all my favorite parts of the story, because the plot of the story also centers on this criminal that is targeting the family, that is seeking to go and kill them or whatever. That was my least favorite part of the story, and I can imagine a lot of people picking up this book expecting a mystery suspense thriller and expecting that story to have a good twist and to be quite intense. And I just don't feel like that's, for me, the point of this book or why I wanted to reread it. I don't even know if I cared about that storyline as much when I read this book as a kid, but as an adult, I could tell you I did not care. I did not care about this criminal. I just cared about the situation of being uprooted from your life, leaving your boyfriend and friends behind, and then taking on this other identity with your family. That was most interesting to me. I love the book again for that reason, though it was slow in places. And the other thing I want to say that I love about returning to Lois Duncan's books as an adult is the way that she writes endings, because I noticed this when I read Stranger with My Face, which is probably my favorite Lois Duncan book. Her endings are not tied up in a neat little bow. They have some dark tones to them. I mean, they do wrap up the story, but there is a little bit of openness and there is a little bit of darkness. And I love how she does that. So I am not widely recommending this book, of course, but it was a nostalgic reread for me and thought I'd go ahead and talk about it. Transitioning now to some life and channel updates. First, I want to say that I noticed that my channel reached above the 8K milestone in the month of May. So thank you so much, whether you're a new subscriber or you've been here for a while. I just want to say I appreciate you all so much. And as far as channel stuff is concerned, there were a few things that happened in the month of May and even early June. So I'm just going to combine both since this video is getting out late. I was a guest on NLR Together, that's Jake's channel from Nerd Level Rising. I was a guest on his channel for a live show discussion, and it was so much fun. So I highly recommend checking out the replay of that if you didn't see it live. So I'll leave a link to that in the description below. And Jake is wonderful. I talked him into doing a daily buddy read with me of The Claw of the Conciliator. That's book 2 in Book of the New Sun, as we're part of that larger group read along of that series. And so what we're doing is we're reading a chapter a day, and then we're bouncing ideas back and forth between the two of us so we can see if we missed anything or what we're noticing, because there's so much to unpack in Wolf's writing. So it really helps to process the text, to take it slow that way, but also just having a friend to talk through what we're noticing. So it's neat because we're both noticing different things and then able to combine our ideas, and I hope that makes us a little more prepared for when we get together for the next discussion. And then other than that, many of you might know, but I was in Europe last month. I went to Amsterdam, London, and Paris. I'll get into that a little bit more a little later, but it's the reason why content has slowed down this last month. But I did pre-record a discussion before I left with my friend David from Four Corners of the Page. We had a discussion about book difficulty and had such a wonderful time with that discussion. It was so much fun. It was a very delightful discussion, and it seemed very well received. I received several DMs from people who said that they watched and enjoyed the entire discussion, and David and I had so much fun connecting and talking about that topic that we've decided we're going to have a few more discussions. We will have more discussions that are yet to come, so stay tuned for those. And I was a guest on David's channel for a Malazan Hot Takes video collab, and that was with Shay, Alex, and Philip. It was so much fun. Unfortunately, it is full spoilers for Malazan Book of the Fallen. I say unfortunately because I know some people haven't finished the series yet, but if you haven't finished the series yet, I highly recommend putting that video on your watch later list because it was genuinely surprising. I had no idea what the takes were going to be, and I shared a couple of hot takes that I've never shared before on my channel. And it was fun because not only did we surprise each other with our hot takes, but we got to react to the hot takes with a red card or a red book, which meant we disagreed, a green card, which meant we agreed, or a yellow card, which meant we felt neutral about it. And then we had to explain our reactions to the hot take. So it was so much fun. It was very interactive. And then I was also on David's channel very, very recently for a wonderful collab that he organized of booktubers talking about their favorite album, their favorite musical album of all time. And I cheated. I couldn't choose just one. I chose two. But it was so much fun to hear what each person had to say about their favorite musical album of all time. And it was neat to note some of the parallels between love of music and love of literature. There seems to be some kind of through line there or some kind of connection there. And then I had David on my channel very, very recently for the last Why Read episode. That was with Alan from the Library of Alexandria. I always put careful thought into who I pair for Why Read episodes, and I knew I wanted to get David on Why Read sooner rather than later because he's going to be moving to Tokyo soon. And so I know the time zones are going to be a little more challenging when he moves there. So I thought about who to pair him with, and I thought about Alan because I noticed there were several things that Alan and David shared in common. And the funny thing is, they connected so quickly, so swimmingly in that Why Read episode that we didn't even get to several items in my list. So we're talking about possibly doing a part 2 to that discussion. And if we do, I will, of course, update you all. And then let's see. I was also in a collaboration video on Preacher Reads channel. That's a fairly new channel to me. I met Preacher Reads through that larger Book of the New Sun discussion, and he did a collaboration video of booktubers talking about their favorite book that is below a 3.85 average rating on Goodreads. And it worked out perfectly for me because I did a spoiler-free review of a book last year on my birthday that I felt was a little low as far as average ratings are concerned. I talked about it in my review, so I remembered that, and so it was easy for me to put together a more condensed version of my review for that video. As I mentioned, I did travel to Europe in the month of May. My husband and I went to Amsterdam and London and Paris, and it was so much fun. The reason we organized that trip is because my husband is a fan of a musician named Steven Wilson. This is a musician I knew next to nothing about before this trip, but we found out that Steven Wilson was going to perform 2 back-to-back shows in London. He is from London, and my husband was so eager to see him because he doesn't go on tour very often that he booked tickets for both nights. And then we found out that Steven Wilson is in fact touring in the US later this year. He'll be in a city nearby in the fall, but it was still fun to go and see this musician in his hometown. And all 3 cities were wonderful. Amsterdam is so beautiful. Loved the architecture, loved the canals. We went to Anne Frank's house, which was very special, and then went to the larger museum there. I cannot remember the name of the museum off the top of my head, and saw the Night's Watch painting and all the sights there. And it was spectacular. It was wonderful. And then when it came to London, London was just beautiful. It was wonderful. Enjoyed London so much. Of course, enjoyed the shows that were there. The only unfortunate thing about the London trip is that I somehow accidentally forgot my Kindle at the Airbnb we were staying at. And sadly, that Airbnb owner has not returned it to me. He has not sent it back yet. And then after London, we went to Paris. Paris looked exactly as I imagined it to look. I think Paris got better and better the longer we were there because the weather was so perfect. In fact, the weather in all 3 places we visited couldn't have been more perfect. We were even told that by the locals in all 3 places that we lucked out as far as weather is concerned. So it was just so stunning. We went to this gorgeous park. It was absolutely glorious. And of course, going to the Louvre was amazing. I loved going and seeing the Opera House there, just touring around that area. So it was absolutely stunning. Gorgeous trip all around. Had a wonderful time. And I guess that just about covers it from me. Please let me know in the comment section below what you've been up to, what you've been reading. Let me know your thoughts about my Empire of Silence and Wall of Storms feelings. Was it me? Was it the book? Let me know. If you want to just say hi in the comments to let me know you're here, please do so. I always love hearing from you. And thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.